Chapter 5. Frantically, Frank flung open the hood and examined the engine. In a few minutes, he discovered the trouble. "The fuel pump," he announced. "Uh-oh," Chet sighed. "And we're miles from any service garage." "We're not stranded, though," Frank assured him. "I suspected that pump was going, so I put a spare in the trunk. It was going to be at least 15-20 minutes to change that pump, and by that time, that kidnapped car will be far away," Chet finished. "I better notify the Bayport Police Headquarters." Frank turned to the car's two-way radio to the proper frequency and gave the license plate number of the suspect's car.
"We'll get busy on it right away," came the answer. "Incidentally, FBI men have been here and out to the Martin farm. I'll contact them. There's been no news so far."
Frank replaced the mic. He and Chet worked feverishly to install the new fuel pump and soon had the engine running.
"No chance of us catching up with the sedan now,"
Chet remarked as the boys once again got underway.
"They have nearly a half an hour head start."
"I'll bet that the kidnappers wouldn't stop at Gresham, now that they've learned that we're after them." 10 minutes later, Frank stopped the car. He backed into a side road and pulled out again, and then turned to retrace his route. "I want to go up that lane the kidnapped car came out of and see what we can find up there." Reaching it, Frank pulled in. The ground was stony and full of holes, and progress was slow. Half a mile further on, an old inn, apparently closed, came into view. It had a long, low, white building with a wide veranda, and the boys got out of the car, and Frank knocked several times, hoping someone might be inside. There was no response. "Nobody home," Chet grumbled. Just then the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard. The door sprang open, and a surly-faced man confronted them.
"What do you want?"
he growled. "Sorry to bother you, sir," Frank said, "but have you seen a black four-door sedan within the past hour?"
"You got the nerve waking me up to ask such a stupid question?" the man snapped. "I don't know nothing about no dang sedan."
"Have you had any visitors recently?" Frank persisted. "There was a wrecked car laying in a ditch close to the spot where your lane ends on the road. Did anyone come here looking for help?" The man looked at the boys suspiciously.
"Get out of here before I kick you off the porch."
"Well, have it your way," Frank retorted. "I'm certain that there were kidnappers in that sedan that I asked you about. If you know anything, you better tell me, or you'll be held as an accessory."
"Kidnappers?" the man cried out. "Okay, so there was some guys walking here late at last night."
"How many were there?" Frank demanded.
3. One said they had an accident and asked if they could stay at my place for a while. They paid me real good, so I let 'em come on in."
"Please describe the men for us, could you?"
"One was tall and one was short," the proprietor replied nervously. "The big guy said they're brothers named Wagner, and they were carrying the third guy. He was wrapped in a blanket 'cause he seemed to have been knocked out. I couldn't see his face. The big guy, he made a telephone call to Gresham, and the car come pick him up about an hour and a half later. I can't tell you any more than that."
He stepped back into the house and then slammed the door in the boy's face. "Sure a sociable fella," Chet commented as the boys drove off. "He did give us one lead," Frank said. "The wreck was theirs, and the pickup car came from the direction of Gresham. Chet, I'm afraid Joe was hurt. We gotta get to Gresham. We'll call Collig and tell him that we just heard." He tuned in to the Bayport headquarters and left a message. On reaching Gresham, Frank cruised up and down the side streets that were flanking the wide boulevard, hoping to spot the sedan, but had no luck. He then headed for the local police headquarters. "Dad introduced me to Police Chief Stanton when we passed through this town several months ago," he said. The boys entered the neat red brick building, and Frank introduced himself and Chet to the desk sergeant on duty. They were ushered into the office of the chief. "Frank Hardy, how are ya?" Stanton said, extending his hand in greeting. "Come on in, sit down." "Has Chief Collig in Bayport been in touch with you?" Frank asked. "Yeah. So far we've had no word on the sedan, or the men traveling it. One of them was injured. You sure that your brother was kidnapped?" "Without a doubt." Stanton muttered. "The sedan's probably miles away by now with a different license plate, but our men, they'll be sure to keep a good lookout." Realizing they could do no more here, Frank and Chet decided to return to Bayport. "What do you suppose our next move ought to be?" Chet asked. "Well, whoever kidnapped Joe might ask for a ransom, Chet. I'd better stick close to the phone that's at home there in case someone tries to establish contact." And then Frank's heart sank as he thought of having to tell his mother and father and aunt that Joe was missing. When he pulled into the Hardy garage sometime later, Frank shut off the ignition and sat quietly for several seconds. Then he took a deep breath and climbed out of the car. He had no sooner entered the house when Miss Hardy rushed to meet him. "What happened to Joe?" she cried. Frank was startled by her question. Before answering, he hugged his mother and led her into the living room. "I just got home and decided to telephone the Morton farm, and I spoke to Isla," Miss Hardy explained. "She seemed terribly upset and started to tell me something about Joe and then stopped. She then said that you were on your way here and that you would explain." Frank related the whole story of Joe's disappearance. Miss Hardy was stunned by the news, and tears filled her eyes. "I would have hoped to have told you sooner," Frank said, "but I was hoping that I'd find Joe before we had to." Although Miss Hardy worried about the dangers involved in her family's sleuthing activities, she rarely displayed her concern openly. But now she could not hide her anxiety, and she began to tremble. "Oh, we gotta do something. Have you notified the police?" "Yes," Frank answered, "as well as the FBI. "Your father. He should be told about this at once." "We can't reach him, though, Mum," Frank reminded her. The hours dragged on into early evening. Miss Hardy continually walked the floor, saying over and over, "Oh, this is dreadful, dreadful." Frank paced around nervously, mulling over in his mind the events that had taken place during the past few days. Just then, the telephone rang. Was it the kidnapper calling? Frank rushed to answer the call. "Frank, this is Chief Collig." "Yes, Chief, is there any news?" "Not much. The police managed to detect the scratched-off serial number on the engine block of the car that was laying on the ditch. It was traced through the State Bureau of Motor Vehicles. The car was stolen yesterday evening from a man in Lewiston, and no one saw the thief." "Well, we're right back where we started," Frank said. After a late supper, Frank settled himself into a wing chair within easy reach of the telephone. The hours ticked by, with no word from Joe or his abductors. Finally, through sheer exhaustion, Frank dozed off. When he arose, the sun was already sending bright, warm rays into the room. Frank got up and began to pace back and forth, and he and his mother ate a sketchy breakfast. They grew more uneasy when the morning passed without any news of Joe. Shortly after noontime, a taxi stopped in front of the Hardy house. A tall, angular woman carrying a small suitcase got out of the cab and hurried towards the house. "It's Aunt Gertrude," Frank announced to his mother.
"Oh, I'm glad to be home,"
Miss Hardy exclaimed as she entered the house like a rush of wind. She glanced at Miss Hardy and immediately sensed that something was troubling her.
"Oh, Laura, you look exhausted. Haven't you been getting enough sleep? What's wrong?"
"We have something to tell you. You better sit down," Frank declared. He broke the news about Joe's disappearance as gently as he could. His story, however, sent Aunt Gertrude springing from her chair.
"That's terrible! Poor Joe! Call the police! Call the FBI! Do something!" she cried.
"Try to be calm," Frank pleaded. "The police and the FBI, they've already been notified."
"Oh, I felt it in my bones," Aunt Gertrude exclaimed. "Something like this was bound to happen." "Now, Gertrude, please," Miss Hardy interrupted.
Aunt Gertrude continued to rattle on.
"Oh, you can't be too careful these days. The world is full of rude and nasty people. Now, you take this morning, for example. When I was walking at the platform at Gresham, suddenly this big, fair-haired man stepped right in front of me, carrying a bulging briefcase, and part of its zipper was torn, and some of the papers inside was sticking out. Well, this clumsy ox, he gave me a hard bang on my arm with that dirty, beat-up old briefcase. I was about to give him a piece of my mind when he just deliberately pushed me aside."
Her words had seized Frank's attention. The man sounded like the one that Chet had stepped on the airport terminal, and Frank and Joe had chased later. Just could be he was one of the kidnappers, and the suspect's car had gone towards Gresham.
"And then that crowning insult," she went on. He called me an old whaler. Can you just imagine? I hadn't fished for a whale in my whole life, and next this big fair-haired lummox just walked over to two other men and handed them the briefcase." Aunt Gertrude continued. "I was so furious I decided to demand an apology. I went up to that big man and tapped him on the shoulder. He must have known me, because just then he said, 'Hardy.' Well, he turned and glared at me and then hurried off with his friends. Oh, the nerve!"
Frank had already jumped to his feet. He was obviously excited. "Did you see what was written on the papers in that briefcase?"
"Oh, I wasn't close enough to read them, but one of them, it had red and blue stripes on it."
"He was one of the men that we suspect!" Frank cried out. "Auntie, did you hear any more of the men's conversation? Anything at all?"
"No, not really,"
she answered, somewhat puzzled by her nephew's questions.
"I only caught a word or two. The fair-haired man said something about caves. Oh, yes, that's it, caves. I remember, because it struck me at the time that he had bad manners, that he ought to be living in one."
Frank darted to the phone and called Chet. "I think I've latched on to an important lead. I need your help, Chet." "I'm ready to go any time you say." "I'll be right over," Frank said. End of chapter 5.